Hi, good morning, and welcome to another Manhattan Institute eventcast brought to you by our new Policing and Public Safety Initiative. I'm Rafael Mengual, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Now, before we get going, I wanted to quickly remind everyone that during today's event, you should feel free to send us your questions as they come to you through the comment function of whatever platform you're watching us on. I'll do my very best to work in as many as I can during the discussion. Now, the Manhattan Institute's Public Safety and Policing Initiative was launched in order to have a meaningful impact on criminal justice policy debates, not just through intelligent scholarship and commentary, but also by engaging with and learning from top flight practitioners whose expertise is derived from experience. And today's panel, I think, is going to be a really great example of that. The topic of today's discussion is what's come to be known as the progressive prosecutor movement. Now, for more than a century, local prosecutors, district, county, or state's attorneys were generally understood to be enforcers of the law, individuals whose primary mission was to secure the public safety by bringing criminals to justice. But over the last few years, more and more of those offices have come to be held by individuals who campaigned not on public safety primarily, but on criminal justice reform. Individuals who promised to use their offices to enact these changes that their supporters were not enabled to enact through the political process have seen quite a bit of victories. Now, what sort of changes are we talking about? I'm talking about things like adopting policies of non-prosecution as to certain offenses, policies that prohibit the pursuit of certain sentencing enhancements, or that block prosecutors from speaking in opposition to the parole of even dangerous offenders. Now, the success of this movement in just a few short years has been astounding, which makes today's panel so important. And with that, I'd like to introduce who we have today. And I'm so pleased to be joined by three individuals who I think we'll all learn a lot from. First, we have Andrew Mccarthy, who's a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. We have William McSwain, who was recently brought on as a partner at Duane Morris, but spent nearly 3 years serving as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And we have Terrence Monahan, who just closed the book in a storied career with the NYPD until earlier this year, where he served as Chief of Department. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.
Good to be with you.
Great. I want to get right into it and start with you, Andy, and just, have you do two things. First, kind of give our listeners here a sense of what makes a prosecutor a, quote, progressive prosecutor as part of this movement. What are some of the things that characterize the people who have been winning some of these offices? And the second part of the question is, what would you attribute their electoral success to? Does it owe to a shift in public attitudes, or is it driven by sort of special interests?
Well, thanks so much, and thank you to the Manhattan Institute for having me today. I think the best way to put what a progressive prosecutor is and what this movement is it's an anti-prosecutorial orientation, or maybe better, an orientation along the lines of the notion that prosecution is not the proper response by the society as it has traditionally been to criminal justice matters. It's basically the idea that there are alternative resolutions or alternative vehicles for dealing with criminal justice matters than investigation, prosecution, and sentencing in the criminal justice system. And I was a prosecutor for a long time. It's important for prosecutors to be sensitive to defense-oriented concerns. So I'm not suggesting that the concerns that are raised by progressive prosecutors have no place, but I think for the most part, for good prosecutors, you want people who are oriented to prosecution as a proper solution and making that work. And we're talking about officials who have a diametrically opposite orientation. And while I think there are, there've obviously been major incidents in the last number of years, which gave some impetus to what's known as the criminal justice reform movement. I think that's a misnomer in a lot of ways, because a lot of the things that are proposed are not reforms in the sense of making things better. But leaving the fact that there are those incidents aside, and they've been very important, they've often been very racially charged, I think this was largely a target of opportunity for practical politics, in the sense that in most big cities, in a lot of big cities across the country, you have these progressive prosecutors now. In most big cities, the prosecution or the district attorney and county attorney elections, which tended to be Democratic, ballot box traditional elections, they used to be, maybe 5-figure exercises in terms of campaign finance. And a lot of these cities are one-party cities. So basically, if you got nominated by the party, you became the district attorney. And I think with what progressives who have access to extraordinary monetary streams, what they realized is if they flooded the zone with a lot of campaign financing, they were able to blow away the opposition in these races and get their own people elected. And this is very important because executive power, and especially the discretion that you have in determining what your prosecution priorities are going to be and how they're going to be carried out, if it's very determined and willful, it's got a potential to more quickly change things and more thoroughly change things than either legislative power or judicial power. And that's why I think they set their sights on it.
Thanks for that. Chief Monahan, I want to move on to you a little bit. So Andy just mentioned that, something that seems to be characterizing, the people who have styled themselves as progressive prosecutors is that they believe that there are some kind of effective alternatives to the sort of traditional means of dealing with offenders in the criminal justice system. As someone who was near the top of one of the biggest law enforcement agencies in the country, I think you might be able to sort of give us some insight as to whether that's the case, whether some of these things that are being marketed as alternatives are effective alternatives. And I want to just also get your sense of what, if anything, would you say is kind of the most dangerous aspect of the progressive prosecutor movement, for those concerned about public safety.
Got it. Thank you, Raphael. Yeah, listen, a lot of the progressive prosecution started with low-level offenses, quality of life offenses. Here in New York, started with the non-prosecution of fare evasion, which just allowed people to get directly into our subway systems without paying. It progressed now into loitering for prostitution and a few other events. It's something that we can deal with. We've done it with low-level drugs too, diversionary programs for low-level drugs. And that wasn't a problem. The arrest was made and they would have to go into some sort of program to be able to get out of the prosecution. The danger is when it keeps on expanding. And that's what's happened. It expanded specifically in Brooklyn for a while for diversionary programs for individuals carrying guns. And to me, that was always problematic. If someone is walking around on the streets of New York carrying a gun in their waistband and a cop risks his life to take that gun off of that man's waist, well, I don't know if that should be put into a diversionary program where in 12 months is as if that arrest had never occurred. And these are individuals quite often that may have been arrested previously, just not convicted, known gang members that have been put into these diversionary programs. We've had incidences where individuals on diversion have been involved in shootings. And that's a danger. You can do some progressive work. You can not prosecute some things. But once you start reaching a new level, that's where it gets dangerous to the communities. And that's, we've seen an uptick in the violence in New York City. And it's not just from the prosecutors. We have the progressive legislation that's going on here, which even if a prosecutor wants to be more conservative, wants to send someone into jail, they just can't. The new bail reforms that have taken place, it prevents a prosecutor from asking for bail for a robbery third degree, a burglary third degree. Someone steals a car in New York City, he has to be given a desk appearance ticket. It doesn't discourage people from committing these crimes. And even if someone commits a crime that a bail can be given to, it has to be the least restrictive bail. That means if this person has always shown up to court in previous cases, no matter what his history is, a judge is required to give him a bail that he can make. And this is causing a problem for us. So we're seeing individuals that should never, ever be back out on the streets, walking the streets.
Yeah, I think, the sort of repeat offender problem is something, I know for me personally has been, sort of the primary area of concern with respect to progressive prosecution. You mentioned the crime uptick here in New York. Of course, New York is not the only jurisdiction in the country where there's been, a sharp uptick in serious violent crimes. Philadelphia has also seen quite a bit in the way of violent crime increases. And Philadelphia is also home to sort of one of the main figures in the progressive prosecutor movement, which is Larry Krasner. And I think I'm getting this right, but Mr. McSwain can correct me if I'm wrong, but every year since Krasner has been in office, the city of Philadelphia has seen homicides go up. And so I wanted to bring him into the conversation here and just ask him whether, he is as U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, whether you saw some of the same things that Chief Monahan just described, and whether you attribute some of those things to the uptick in serious violent crime in Philadelphia.
Well, thank you, Raphael. That's absolutely true that as soon as Mr. Krasner came in and conducted what I'll call his radical experiment, we saw an immediate uptick in homicides, an immediate uptick in shootings, and we saw terrible levels in his first 2 years in office in 2018 and in 2019. And then it got even worse in 2020. We had 500 homicides in Philadelphia, which is more than we've had in a very long time. We set a record, unfortunately, a dubious record of over 2,200 shootings, an all-time record. And unfortunately, 2021 is off to an even worse start. We're up about 30% from those horrific numbers in 2020. We're up about 30% in 2021. So with any radical experiment, or any experiment at all, it's important to look at the evidence and important to look at the data. And the returns are in Philadelphia. This radical experiment has failed. And what's very interesting is that the wall that the media, the protective wall that they've created around Krasner, and also some of his supporters and folks in the Democratic Party in Philadelphia have created around him over the last few years, is starting to crumble. And Philadelphia, I think, can be a leading indicator on this. For example, Mr. Krasner has a primary election coming up next month, and the Philadelphia Democratic Party just recently declined to endorse him, which is really extraordinary thing that almost never happens. And even yesterday, in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the main paper in Philadelphia, they printed an anti-Krasner cartoon where a placard on his desk says, "The buck stops anywhere but here." And it talks about how he blames COVID for the uptick in violence, and he blames the police for the uptick in violence, and blames anyone but his own policies. But it's his policies, these radical policies of not charging certain kinds of cases, undercharging cases, dismissing cases, pleading cases out, offering defendants sweetheart plea deals, so therefore there are almost no trials in the Philadelphia criminal courts anymore because all the cases plead out, because if you're a defendant, you've committed a horrific crime and you're offered a sweetheart plea deal, you're usually going to take it. He's losing cases left and right because he has inexperienced prosecutors, because he's fired all the experienced prosecutors. And incidentally, his primary opponent, Mr. Carlos Vega, is one of those homicide prosecutors that he fired as soon as he came into office. So you have now the unfortunate effect that the city is really feeling of these policies, and people are starting to wake up to it. And I'm very interested to see how the primary results work out next month, because Philadelphia could be a leading indicator. I mean, Philadelphia had one of the first progressive prosecutors in Mr. Krasner. He's one of the most outspoken, and he kind of snuck up on people when he first got elected. He was in a 7-way primary where he was elected with much less than 50% of the vote, and he had a lot of outside money that Andy referenced. So we'll see in about a month from now whether this can be a turning point for Philadelphia, where someone could come in who is concerned about public safety, unlike Mr. Krasner. That could be a turning point for Philadelphia, and maybe that could also be a leading indicator for what other cities will be experiencing.
So we know that political turning points take time. But when you are sort of on the front line of fighting crime in a city like Philadelphia or New York, you can't always wait, for the next election to come around. And so one of the questions I have for you, Bill, is, was there anything that was being done on the sort of local level to, maybe try and avoid some of these policies in extreme cases? I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is, potentially rerouting more cases, to the federal side where there's concurrent jurisdiction, say for a prohibited possessor of a firearm. Is that something that you saw in your experience in Philadelphia as U.S. Attorney?
Absolutely. There is a very large potential federal role, and I made it a priority as U.S. Attorney to move a lot of resources in my office into violent crime prosecutions, because I saw the need in Philadelphia. I saw what was happening. We had to push back against these radical policies. And I think things would have been much worse, as bad as they are in Philadelphia. They would have been much worse if we didn't have that really robust federal response. There's largely a concurrent jurisdiction on a lot of these violent crime cases. As a Fed, you can prosecute things like Hobbs Act robbery. You can prosecute violent criminal organizations. You can prosecute certain murders. You can prosecute carjackings. So you can reach into the local system and you can grab some of those cases and take them federally. And we did that very aggressively in my tenure as U.S. Attorney, not just when cases were charged that we thought were charged incorrectly or not charged at all by Krasner, but sometimes even after he got a conviction. And we looked at the conviction and we looked at the sentence and we said, this is not fair. This is, for example, the first case that we did like that, there was a shop owner, an immigrant shop owner in Philadelphia who was robbed and shot and paralyzed by an assailant who was coming in and trying to rob his shop. And Krasner gave him a sweetheart plea deal without trying to sneak it in, with nobody even knowing that it was happening really in the court system, where this offender got 3 years sentence. And we said, wait a minute, time out. That doesn't make any sense. That's not an effective deterrent. That's not justice. And so we came in, took that case, and if you get permission from Washington, you can get what's called a pettit policy waiver, where even if there is a conviction in the local system, you can still prosecute that case federally. So we took that case, and we ended up getting a sentence of over 14 years. And we had other examples like that as well. So there is a role for the feds to push back against irresponsible, progressive policies. And it's my hope that that role will continue under President Biden, because it's very, very important.
Chief Monahan, Mr. McSwain just talked a lot about sort of his role in proactively sort of taking on some of these cases. My question to you is, was there anything going on within the NYPD where the police department itself was being proactive on that front and trying to reroute cases to the federal side when they were worried, when the department was worried that, a particular offender might not get the treatment that was called for in a certain kind of case?
Absolutely. We have a tremendous, tremendous relationship with both the Eastern and Southern districts in New York. Southern District, for years, we've had a great relationship, and many guns we take there. So anytime we get someone who has a previous felony conviction, we get it through our units, and we study the individual and see if it's appropriate to go to federal prosecution. We actually had a system worked out with the Southern District and now the Eastern District that if a case on its face looks good, we would reach out directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office, bypassing the local system, and bring the case directly into the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution. This ends the arguments that happen quite often when a prosecutor from the federal agency reaches into a case and takes it away from a local prosecutor. Obviously, I have 5 different prosecutors here in New York City. Each one has a different feeling for it. The Bronx, working with the Southern District, they give up guns all the time, knowing that they can get a better prosecution for a convicted felon going into the federal system. Brooklyn now has really, I have to give them a lot of credit. They are working closely with Easton. Since Rich Donahue took over and now set the charm, it's been a world of difference getting cases prosecuted in the Eastern District. When we take cases federally, we're seeing 80% of those defendants being held in on bail. When we take a look at gun cases, and these are all gun cases, we take a look at gun cases locally, 13% are held in on bail. Wow. This is a huge, huge difference. And we've utilized the Hobbs Act quite a few times. There was a high-profile case here in Manhattan not that long ago. Individuals going into a Chanel store, basically wiping the store out. And they'd been hitting stores all over New York. It was a crew out of Brooklyn. We identified the main person, but if we had arrested him locally, the charge would have been a grand larceny charge, which is requiring him to be given bail immediately. We spoke with Southern District. They were able to put together a Hobbs Act on the individual. We ended up picking him up poolside in Florida and bringing him back for federal prosecution. You know, it sent a message that this isn't a crime that is going to go unpunished. So this is without a doubt, it is a great tool for us. So far this year in New York, we've taken 194 cases, gun cases, federally. It makes a difference. And I tell you, I've sat in the car with the bad guy, and when they see you passing the local criminal court, heading down to federal court, they get that little feeling in their rectum where they know, oh my God, this is serious.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's something that I don't think quite a lot of people know about, that police departments and federal prosecutors have been working together over the last few years to try and sort of minimize the damage done by some of these more radical policies. And Andy, I want to bring you back in here because I think the politics in Washington have changed a little bit, right? The Biden administration very much campaigned on the idea of criminal justice reform. You've got Vanita Gupta going up at DOJ. I think there's a concern here that, as I listen to Chief Monahan and Mr. McSwain here, that this might not be available as a tool for much longer if the progressive prosecutor movement bleeds into the federal system. Do you see that as a risk?
I think it's a big risk and a big concern. And one of the things that you could tell by what Bill said versus what the chief just said, considering them together, the most important federal success stories in anti-crime. And I had the privilege of working at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern New York for over 20 years. So I worked under administrations of Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. The most important success stories are the ones where the feds and the city and state authorities work together. So whether it's terrorism or gang crime or gun crime or drug crime, there were existing task force arrangements that long predate this recent run of progressive prosecutors that we're dealing with, that are actually major success stories in terms of the overall reduction in crime from the early 1990s, through about 2015, 2018, and anything that would undermine that. If you suddenly had a situation where political rivalries had the effect of deteriorating or eroding those kind of collegial arrangements that have existed for years, that's going to be a very serious problem in terms of crime increases. I mean, even with the task force arrangements that we still have and the kind of cooperation that the chief just talked about, we're still seeing a significant rise in crime. We're not back in the 80s and the early 90s yet, but the trend is troubling. If you dismantle those arrangements, which have been a big part of crime reduction over the last generation, you are courting disaster, to my mind.
No, I think that's exactly right. And there's a question here from the audience I'm going to modify a little bit, because it gets at an important issue, which is the question is basically, there is an assumption at work here in some of our arguments on this panel that reflects the belief that incarceration or pretrial detention can reduce crime. I assume that all of us are on the same page and thinking it's a combination of both incapacitation and deterrence. But a lot of people, particularly within the progressive prosecutor movement, seem to have convinced themselves and others that incarceration does more harm than good in the end. And my personal feeling is that this is something that's likely truer with respect to lower level offenders, people who don't have long criminal histories. But my guess is that's not the case with higher rate offenders and people who have a significant risk of committing more serious violent crime. So, Mr. McSwain, I want to go with you first. What's your reaction to that kind of argument? As someone who's been in the seat of a prosecutor in a big city for a long time.
I would say, first of all, that you have to be smart about incarceration and that you have to try to incarcerate the worst offenders. And if people think that incarcerating the worst offenders does not reduce violent crime, I would invite them to look at a situation in Philadelphia, for example, where we actually, I've spoke about this a lot when I was U.S. attorney, I'd have press conferences on it. We looked at who are the people who are pulling the trigger and causing these murders in Philadelphia that is causing the homicide rate to go up. And there were literally hundreds of them who were people who should have been in prison, but weren't in prison because Krasner either wasn't pursuing probation violations, wasn't pursuing pretrial detention of any kind. So people would get out when they were picked up for other offenses and then they would commit murder, or they served some ridiculously short amount of time for a serious offense and were released, and then they were committing murder. So you can literally connect the dots on these individual murders. So if someone says, well, I just don't think incarceration does anything, if they just take that lazy all-purpose argument, they're just not looking at the facts. Look at the actual people who are committing the murders. Those people often are people that clearly should have been in jail and aren't in jail because of these progressive policies. And it also points out one of the fallacies, one of the false narratives that many of these progressive prosecutors push. Not just Krasner, but I've heard this from people like Kim Fox in Chicago, Marilyn Mosby in Maryland, and others, where they try to say that what they're doing is they are focusing more on the serious crimes, which is why they aren't prosecuting the less serious crimes. We're going to move our resources away from things like prostitution and vandalism and retail theft and all these small potatoes kind of things. And we're going to be smart on crime by moving resources into attacking the really serious violent crime that people care about. That is a bald-faced lie, because they are taking their foot off the gas everywhere. And the area where they are doing the least is when you're talking about the most serious violent crime. But that is a narrative that, again, some of their protectors in the media take and they run with. But if you look at the facts, and if you're in the trenches like I was in Philadelphia for the last 3 years as U.S. attorney, it's absolutely false. The area where the progressive prosecutors are the most damaging is not because they're ignoring the low-level crimes. They're the most damaging where they're completely ignoring the proven strategies for combating the serious violent crime.
Yeah, thank you for that. Chief Monahan, with respect to the incarceration issue, New York has in many ways been a model for reformers, right? I mean, over the last 20 or 30 years, at both the city and state level, you've seen quite a bit of incremental decarceration, sort of year over year, both at the state prison level and the local jail level. That doesn't seem to have made the sky fall, right? We haven't really seen huge crime spikes until recently. But does what Mr. McSwain just said, does that remain true in a city like New York? We know that nationally about 37% of those convicted of violent felonies were either on probation, parole, or out on bail or with a pending charge at the time of their arrest. Is that something that you see as driving the most serious offenses in New York, where you have a huge chunk of these people who could have been but weren't incarcerated?
Absolutely. And listen, we drove down the prison population. We go back to pre-2014, it was around 11,000. Pre-COVID, we were up to around 5,300. COVID hits, and all of a sudden, they dropped our population down to 3,900. People were let out. People who shouldn't have been let out were let out, and that's where
And
we
this is
started.
New York City jails, right?
New York City jails here, Rikers Island. So this is where we started to see the uptick, and we see the violence, and part of this is a judge in New York has no discretion. Not everyone needs to go to jail, but a judge in New York cannot take that person's criminal history into account, whether or not he's a danger to the community, and keep him into jail. He can only keep him in if he's not showing up to court. So we had an incident recently. It was in the Post. A kid, Raquel Wilson, that had 4 previous felony indictments, twice for a gun and 2 for armed robbery. Out on the streets, gets picked up for a gun again. 2 of the cases, he had already pled guilty and was let out on the streets to get another gun while waiting his sentencing. Finally, last week, after it got a lot of media attention, he's in now for 2 consecutive 1-year sentences on the guns, still pending on his Queens things. But when we take a look at just open gun arrest, individuals in New York City with an open gun arrest in 2020 and 21, 172 of them out on the streets with an open gun arrest were involved in a non-fatal or fatal shooting. 94 of them as identified perpetrators, another 78 as persons of interest in a shooting. That means we just haven't proven it beyond up to probable cause to take them in. So that's 172 individuals that had already been taken off the street with a gun. And New York supposedly has the toughest gun laws in the country, that were able to go get another gun and shoot somebody else. So that's a problem. We're not asking for everyone to be in jail. I would like to focus on those running around with illegal guns in the city that are willing to do violence. If we take them off the street, if a message is clearly sent that you carry a gun illegally in New York City, that you're going to do some jail time, that'll make a difference. It'll keep the streets a lot safer, and we'll get back to the numbers that we were doing just 2 years ago of under 800 shootings in this city.
It's interesting because you would think that between the kind of data points that you just referenced and the serious violent crime upticks that so many American cities have seen, that there would be a much larger pushback that would manifest itself in a sort of toning down of the rhetoric within the reform movement. I'm not sure that's something we've seen. And Andy, I want to go to you on this. I mean, New York City is about to elect a new district attorney for Manhattan. There are there's a mayoral election coming up. I mean, do you see crime upticks really stunting some of these reform efforts, or is the old adage that crime can sort of be seized on to take people away from reform efforts? Does that seem to not be as true as we once thought it was?
Here's what I think is happening, and I say this as somebody who grew up in the Bronx in the 60s and 70s. So, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that's being tried now was tried then, and that resulted in the crime problem that we had into the early 1990s. And I think, Raphael, a lot of the fact that maybe you would expect a more robust pushback against some of the progressive reforms. We're getting more of one now, but it was pretty muted over the last year and a half before things came to much more of a crescendo. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that they are profiting off the legacy of the last 30 years. So to my mind, it's not so much about taking particular violent criminals off the street, which is important. And I couldn't agree more with Bill's point that the recidivist phenomenon is such that if you take a certain category of very serious criminal off the street, you're going to depress a lot of crime because they're responsible for a lot of crime. But the legacy of the anti-crime methods that were developed from 1990 going forward created a dynamic of order that lasted for a generation. So it wasn't just that you were taking individual criminals off the street. It was that the NYPD and the prosecutors' offices, whether they were federal or state, projected the understanding among the public that the law was going to be enforced. And when you project order, you have less occasion for, having to intervene and having to lock up lower level offenders, because you've done enough of that to convey the signal that the laws are going to be enforced. So it took a long time to get that in place. And I think, as Manhattan Institute has probably pointed out more than anyone else has, this is the most important progressive social development of the last generation. The depression of crime, which was at record highs, in the 70s and 80s, and if you look at where it was in 2016, 2017, it was at phenomenal lows. It took a long time to get that way. It won't take as much time to roll it back, but it'll take some time. And I think we can say that things today are already demonstrably worse than they were 2 years ago. And if you let these trend lines continue, if we come back again in a year, they'll be worse than they are now. And eventually what will happen is what happened in the early 90s, which at a certain point politically, communities say they've had enough. And then you see the result of that in elections, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I think, what the hope would be then that we get to that point much quicker than we got to it in the 90s. Right. And, as I look at the landscape, the political landscape surrounding this issue, I do see some sort of glimmers of hope. Out west in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, there are 2 recall efforts with some real teeth behind them with respect to the appointments of Chesa Boudin and Gascon in Los Angeles. And, Mr. McSwain, you mentioned Mr. Vega's challenge of Krasner in Philadelphia. I mean, one of the questions I have is that, the progressive prosecutor movement seems to have been speaking as if it represents a huge swath of the population in whatever city, the person is running in. But some recent polling, there's one from Gallup on policing, seems to indicate that there may not be as wide support as we think for these kind of radical progressive policies. Did you see that in Philadelphia? Did you see a disconnect between the mandate progressive prosecutors say they had and what people on the ground actually supported? And is that manifesting itself at all in this upcoming election?
I think it's another false narrative that the Krasners of the world push, is that they have this big mandate. As I mentioned before, he was elected with far less than half of the vote. He had about 50,000 votes in the Democratic primary 4 years ago. Okay, 50,000 votes in a city of well over 1 million is not exactly a mandate. He kind of snuck in there. But the part about it that people don't always talk about is that these progressive policies, these woke policies, as is often the case, what they do is they harm African Americans and harm minorities the most, because those are the people who have to live with the crime in these neighborhoods. And they're also the vast majority of the homicide victims and the shooting victims, for example. And I spent a lot of time as U.S. attorney in the neighborhoods, talking to neighborhood groups, talking to shop owners, talking to people who have to put up with this crime. And they are not fans of these policies. They are not fans of Krasner. Krasner's base are the white woke liberals in the rich neighborhoods in Philadelphia who don't have to deal with the crime. And that's one of the main reasons why he didn't get the endorsement, which is an extraordinary thing. He didn't get the endorsement for his reelection because the ward leaders in Philadelphia are getting screamed at by their constituents saying, I can't even send my child down the street without being worried about him or her getting hit with a stray bullet. Okay, so again, I think May 18th in Philadelphia is a very important date. That's the primary date. And we'll see if the people in the neighborhoods who are the ones who suffer under this regime, can they outvote the largely white woke liberals in the rich parts of the city who don't have to deal with these problems who are the type of people who vote for Krasner. And I think that I know more about Philadelphia than I know about other cities, but I think that this phenomenon is also real in other parts of the country.
Yeah, Chief Monahan, I want to bring you in here because Bill mentioned something really interesting, which is that the sort of burden of serious violent crime seems to fall disproportionately on the shoulders of low-income minority neighborhoods, and that's something we see here in New York too. I mean, in a recent piece I wrote that since at least 2008, a minimum of 95% of shooting victims in the city of New York have either been Black or Hispanic. That's been publicly published data for over a decade now, yet people were very surprised to read that statistic. And the question I have for you is that is there something that the city of New York can do to better communicate these risks and better illustrate for people who don't seem to be living in the middle of these high crime areas on what the potential downside risk is of the policies that they're backing?
Listen, we push this out all the time. You read the Post, the Daily News. There are stories every day that we're talking about the violence that's going on in these neighborhoods, who's suffering the most from it. I've been out in Brownsville. I've been out in every one of these neighborhoods talking to the communities. None of them are talking about defunding the police. They're talking about getting more police out there because they want to be safe. They want to be able to go shopping and not have a stray bullet hit them. A 1-year-old killed in Brooklyn, sitting out on a street. These are horrible events that happen. It's going to take a point in time where the elected officials take a look and have a step back and understand what's going on and do what's right as opposed to what's going to get them elected. You go, this is a Democratic city. You're going to win and lose based on your primary. Who's going to vote in that primary? And that seems to be the focus of anyone who's getting elected, that they're not going to make a decision if it's the in crowd in the media right now to say something negative about the police, or they're all going to jump in because that's what's going to get the small percentage of people who come out to an election poll on a primary day to vote. It's going to take the people in these communities that are most affected to educate themselves at what these policies are, who the electeds are that are supporting these policies, and come out and vote on election day, because it's been said numerous times, elections matter.
Andy, if it's true that, the policy agendas of these prosecutors don't seem to be particularly responsive to the concerns of the people living in high crime communities, what is it that the average citizen, can do to maybe speed up the trend that you talked about earlier, where, you kind of lived through that sort of full circle of liberal policies, in the 60s and 70s, leading to serious crime upticks that then, created a backlash. I mean, how do we get people to that point quicker?
Well, you need community leaders to disassociate themselves from the progressive prosecution agenda. If you think back to the 1990s, for example, I'll speak to the federal crime bill because that was the one that I was most familiar with and the one that I had to enforce the most. That was a Clinton administration measure, and it was because by that point in time, communities had come to the point where they wanted aggressive anti-crime measures. So it's not like the progressives believed different things then than they believe now. It was that the leadership and the center of gravity in the different political parties and political constituencies was in favor of exactly what they're trying to distance themselves from in the last election. I mean, the 1994 crime bill, President Biden distanced himself from it this time around. He called it the Biden crime bill at the time because he was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee that was pushing it through. It was Clinton's, signature legislation, and it had a lot of support broadly from Democrats, including the Congressional Black Caucus, and it was a very strong anti-crime measure. So what has to happen is when people get fed up enough, they have to disassociate themselves from this agenda and push for stronger measures. And look, I don't think it's as far off as you might think. I remember when Rudy Giuliani came to the Southern District of New York as the U.S. attorney, it seemed like a kind of a revolutionary idea, at least in federal law enforcement circles, that you were going to throw federal resources at things like, the chief was talking before about Federal Day, when, these guys get locked up and they suddenly realize they're going to federal court, and it's not going to be a more revolving door that they're familiar with. That all happened because people decided, even at the federal level, they decided that electorally and politically, as well as just from a community safety and a public safety and national security analysis, this was popular. People wanted people want to be able to walk their streets safely. They want to be able to operate businesses safely. This isn't like, we talk about the big issues that dominate Washington today, climate, debt policy, trade policy. This hits people where they live. Whether you can walk the streets of your community safely is one of these things that doesn't need to be a hard-edged partisan political issue. It's really about people's quality of life. And when it gets down to it, that's what people want. They want to be safe in their communities.
It's one of the things that that I mentioned earlier at the top of the program was just the incredible amount of electoral success that this movement has had in a short period of time. And just to give people some context, we are now at a point where roughly 40 million Americans are living in jurisdictions with progressive prosecutors. I mean, what do we tell those people who are concerned about crime? What do we tell them to look for? What are the policies they ought to be concerned about? What are the things that they should be looking to hold their prosecutors accountable for? And Mr. McSwain, I'll go with you on that.
Well, there's some obvious ones. If a progressive prosecutor comes out and says, I'm not going to prosecute X, I'm not going to prosecute a whole category of crime. Like, for example, what Mr. Krasner said on one of his first days in office, actually put in writing in a memo. He said, I'm not going to prosecute any retail theft under $500. So you can imagine what that does to most shop owners in Philadelphia. They're being robbed blind on a low level, and they have no real means to fight back. And the police don't want to make any arrests for any retail theft under $500 because they know it's not going to be prosecuted. It's going to be dismissed or withdrawn. So certainly any kind of overt statement like that, and they need to pay attention to what's happening in the serious cases of homicides and serious robberies and shootings and the like. And we can get the message out about these. And I got the message out, I think, pretty well in Philadelphia on the federal level about how we're connecting the dots. It's not rocket science. The people who are committing the murders are people who are largely already convicted felons. They're not allowed to own a gun. That's a federal crime in and of itself. They're being released on bail when they shouldn't be. They're not having probation violations prosecuted, so they should be back in prison for probation violations. Or they're serving sentences that are absurdly short and then getting out and continuing to cause mayhem. And people need to just get angry about that. And I'm already feeling it in Philadelphia. Again, I'm hoping will be a leading indicator. And I agree with Andy that it takes a long time sometimes for the backlash to happen, but I think we're already feeling it. And we felt it a little bit even in 2020, the elections, because I think people largely rejected the idea of defunding the police in the 2020 elections. So again, it's just people paying attention and raising their voice and getting involved in community organizations, and hopefully the pendulum is going to swing back sooner rather than later. But people need to just pay attention to what these progressive prosecutors are doing, and they're not exactly hiding the ball. Okay? A lot of them are very upfront about what they're doing. I mean, a lot of them are just, they're very upfront, and they're actually quite proud of the devastation that they're causing in these urban areas. So just listen to them, and then react is what I would say to the average citizen.
Andy, Bill just mentioned, these sort of broad non-prosecution policies as to whole categories of crime. And what's interesting about that is that the crimes that they are choosing not to prosecute were, of course, duly enacted by elected members of the legislature. And it just seems, I think the word is anti-democratic, that a single individual can essentially abrogate an entire body of law without going through the political process at all. And, when we look at sort of what the causes of this movement's growth were, do you think that there is something to the idea that the progressive prosecutor movement grew because it was seen as a more direct route to reform that was able to end run the political process?
Yeah, this goes exactly back to what you asked me at the beginning. Prosecutorial power is executive power. And in this system, it takes, for legislation to happen, it takes a lot of compromise, and there's a lot of parliamentary tricks, and there's a lot of ways of tripping it up, and it kind of intentionally operates in a very slow manner. And judicial opinions can be a big deal, but we always have to remember with judicial opinions that they're just judgments, and they actually require executive power to carry them out and give them teeth. There's nothing in modern governance that can have the sweeping immediate change that the willful wielding of executive authority is. Like, for example, if a prosecutor comes into power and says, these gang enhancements that the legislature has put in because gang crime is the biggest problem that we have in this community, we're not going to use those anymore because we think that they're a vestige of systemic racism. Now, you may think that, you may be right, you may be wrong. That's not your authority to do. You're as an executive official, your job is to faithfully execute the laws that have been enacted by the legislatures. And what the progressive prosecutor does is kind of shunt all that aside and decide that he is not just executive, but legislator and judicial official all wrapped into one. And it's, what they then tell you is that they're just exercising prosecutorial discretion, which is part of the system. That's not part of the system. Prosecutorial discretion is a common sense policy that says because we have more crime than we have resources, we have to allocate our resources in a sensible way to go after the biggest crime problems. It's not supposed to be a pretext by which the prosecutor essentially amends or repeals the laws that have been passed by the legislature. So that whole idea of executive authority has to be regarded as an abuse rather than just the way that executive authority goes. And to your other point, I would just say I completely agree with Bill that these are the kinds of policies that people should be watching for. But I think at a more 10,000-foot level, they have to understand that who the prosecutor, the elected prosecutor is important. If you go around, most people know who their governor is and who their mayor is. Until recently, when these things have become more notorious, people have no idea who the district attorney is. The reason that the progressive prosecutor movement was able to jump in and get these positions is because they kind of operate behind the scenes. They're kind of anonymous. They were never big deal elections. They were never like, mayor elections, governor elections. They're $1 million affairs. These were, $50,000, $60,000 in the campaigns. They're mostly the party decides them. I think people are starting to see that that's a big deal. You need to know who your DA is and what he or she is trying to do.
Chief Monahan, we only have a few minutes left, so this may end up being the last question. We'll see. But I want to go to you really quick because Mr. McSwain mentioned the whole defunding police narrative earlier. And, I think one of the things that a lot of crime analysts have been worried about is sort of the impact of this anti-police sentiment on police activity, right? There's this idea that police have become somewhat less proactive out of fear, that they won't be treated fairly if they make a mistake in the field, and that in turn, affects crime. do you see the progressive prosecutor movement, to the extent it has, continuing success, sort of, how do you see that affecting the morale of police officers? I mean, if they are going out there and chasing down criminals who they then see sort of get let out, or not get prosecuted to the full extent of the law, does that start to create a rift between two entities that have long been effective because they were seen and saw themselves as members of the same team?
Absolutely. Listen, there is nothing worse than grabbing somebody, pulling a gun off his waist, risking your life to get that individual into custody, and then 3 days later seeing him standing on the same corner with the same gang members. It is extremely disheartening. But I tell you, cops are a unique breed. They're never going to stop. They look at what a prosecutor does and says, there's nothing I can do to change him. I'm still going to go out and I'm going to grab that guy again with a gun. That's why you see so many repeat offenders coming in, because the cops on the street, they know who the bad guys are. And it's a small percentage of the people. And we're dealing with them on a regular, everyday basis. And you're going to keep dealing with them. You keep hitting the cops. This whole sentiment from last year, honestly, the worst year I've ever worked in law enforcement, just between the riots that happened here, just everything negative about police work. But the cops kept working. You would figure that in light of everything, you would have seen a decline in activity. Why do we see a huge increase? Over 1,000 more gun arrests made in New York last year. It is amazing the resiliency that the men and women in law enforcement in this city and in this country have. You can't change what this prosecutor is going to do. You can't change and have to adapt to whatever a legislature does. But law enforcement is the most adaptable people in the world. And their goal is to keep people safe. And they're going to be out there day in and day out, risking their lives to keep people safe. Just last night in the city, cops walked into the middle of a shootout and engaged. This is what they do. They're out there, and it could be a quiet night, and in a second later, they're putting their lives on the line for people that they don't know. So it's disheartening, it's discouraging, but the men and women in law enforcement continue to battle on each and every day.
Bill, I want to throw that same question to you because, I think there's also a possibility that some of what we've seen is people who would have dedicated their careers to public service as prosecutors are maybe becoming less likely to do that if they see themselves as sort of detached from the mission of some of these progressives who have taken over. Is that a risk that we should be concerned about?
Well, first of all, I think that's a great point the chief made about how people in law enforcement, whether you're a prosecutor or you're a police officer or what have you, are very resilient. I have such great admiration for the folks who are on the front lines, and the Philadelphia police in particular were laboring under extremely difficult conditions in the last 3 years and continue to labor under very difficult conditions, but they just do their job and they're very professional. And I think they did a good job under really tough conditions this past summer with the riots and things that were going on with the civil unrest, and showed a lot of restraint, even though they've been criticized in some ways for being too aggressive. I think they showed a lot of restraint when you actually are on the street in the trenches, seeing what they're having to deal with. I am concerned that young people growing up and thinking about their career might go into other areas where before they might consider becoming a police officer or becoming a prosecutor. But there's still great people in the profession, and certainly in my hiring at the federal level is very selective, and so we have hundreds and hundreds of applicants literally for every prosecutor that we hire as an assistant U.S. attorney, and I think it's similar in other jurisdictions. So I think at the federal level, you're always going to have very competitive process, very high quality prosecutors. At the local level too, I think what we need to do, honestly, is we need to vote out these progressive prosecutors, because part of their agenda is to hire people who want to burn down the system, just like these DAs want to burn down the system. So they're hiring people who have no interest in being real prosecutors. Instead, they have other agendas. And if we can get some If the the pendulum swings back, where we get some more responsible people running these big DA's offices in the urban areas in the country, you're going to see top quality people staying in the profession. And when it comes to police officers, now I know that everybody is redoubling their efforts to try to recruit and try to train folks and encourage them to choose what I believe is the most noble profession that you can choose. And that will win out in the long run. People understand that the pull of public service and the pull of law enforcement is very strong. And people are going to continue, I hope, to flock to those areas.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it on that encouraging note. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for a wonderful and enlightening discussion. I'm sure we could have gone for many, many more minutes, if not hours. And I also want to thank all of you at home for tuning in. I do hope that you'll join us for the Manhattan Institute's next event on the state of the administrative state with MI Senior Fellow Jim Copeland and the great Richard Epstein. I'd also encourage you all to stay in touch with the Institute by signing up for our newsletter using the link in the chat, where you'll receive updates from the Policing and Public Safety Initiative. You can always check out the latest research and commentary on our website. And finally, if you're able, please also consider supporting the Institute at the link you see in the chat. MI is, after all, a nonprofit organization, and our work depends on the support of people like you. Once again, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.